Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm conscious that those of us who are here have braved the weather, and most of us have braved London public transport, I say through gritted teeth. My name is Aoife Nolan, and with Shushin Liu, I am delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Doughty Street Chambers Children's Rights Group. And the group brings together barristers from across all practice areas and teams to focus on innovative legal advocacy centred on the rights set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And as our excellent publicity material makes clear, and as I want to share with you this evening, the Chambers, Doughty Street Chambers, was the first of any of the chambers in the UK to have a children's rights group. And the fact that we were the first and have an extremely active children's rights group reflects the fact that the members have extensive expertise across numerous child rights related areas and really wide-ranging experience in bringing down groundbreaking litigation for and concerning children in areas from public law to admin law, immigration, mental health, prison, trafficking, education, child justice, inquests. Beyond the domestic context as well, this is a very important part of our work as a children's rights group. Our barristers have brought leading cases to international and regional courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the International Criminal Court, and indeed this year, a number of our barristers made important submissions in the context of the ICJ proceedings around the advisory opinion on climate change. So we also, in addition to the work as practitioners, because one of the outstanding things about Doughty Street is we have associate tenants, but we also have academic experts. Many of those people, as well as the kind of traditional barrister members, have worked with intergovernmental organisations with a human rights mandate, as well as national human rights institutions, and several members, again, particularly academic experts, but not just those working full time in universities, make major contributions to child rights scholarship, both in the UK and elsewhere. And I know it sounds like advertising, and I know it sounds like shameless promotion, but actually I think it's really important because not that many chambers do it. And I think when people put the time and the effort and the energy into children's rights, which is an area that is really under pressure at the moment, it's important to highlight the work that's being done by our fantastic colleagues here at Doughty Street. However, this evening, we are absolutely delighted and we are deeply honoured that our children's rights lecture is being delivered by Professor Ben Saul. Ben, who is a very old friend, will be speaking to us on Every War is a War Against Children, Terrorism, Counter-Terrorism, and the Fragility of Child Rights. And I should be clear, I don't think there is anyone better placed than Ben to speak on this topic. He is the Challis Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney, and he has an outstanding reputation in scholarship and practice in public international law and counter-terrorism law in particular. And since November 2023, in addition to his extraordinary academic record and contributions, he has been the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. He's an elected fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and amongst many, many, many appointments internationally, he was previously an associate fellow of Chatham House and in London, and of the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism. And then again, he has an academic hat, and he has his UN Special Rapporteur hat, but even prior to that, he's been hugely involved, not just in the theory, but in the black letter law. He has been very involved in the practice of issues around counter-terrorism and human rights law and international law. He's advised UN bodies, he's advised governments, military security agencies and NGOs. He's practiced in international tribunals, and he's undertaken missions in over 45 countries. And one thing that I think is particularly important about Ben's work is that he's a superb communicator beyond academia and beyond legal practice. Because tonight we're talking about effectively terrorism, counter-terrorism and children. And there's very few areas where you have the level of politicized and misleading rhetoric and drumbeating as you do in this particular area. And it is fundamentally important to have someone like Ben who can write an accessible, intelligent, articulate, good to read article in the New York Times, who can do the interviews, who can reach out, because that is such an important skill. And it's one I want to comment on, because I think Ben has been such an important ambassador around this issue, not simply a brilliant writer, not simply someone who talks to the UN, but someone who speaks to society generally around these issues. And Ben is also going to be joined by Zainab Mailaden. And Zainab is a Lebanese journalist. We're delighted she's joining us. And she's a journalist and a humanitarian communications and media professional. She works across conflict and displacement contexts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And over the past 6 years, she has documented the lives of children and families affected by war, forced migration, and crises in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Moldova, Ukraine, and Poland. I want to, at this point, and I loathe the term trigger warning, but I think it's important to flag that Zainab's presentation, given tonight's topic, unsurprisingly, will include images of children who have suffered violence and have life-changing injuries as a result. People should just be conscious of that there will be images that people may find distressing. So now you know. Couple of housekeeping points. In terms of structure, Ben is going to speak for about 40 minutes, including Zainab's input. And we're then going to turn to our expert panel. We're extremely lucky to have with us. We've got a fantastic lineup, each of whom will speak for about 5 to 6 minutes, and then we will throw it open to Q&A, because we really do want this to turn into a conversation. But I will leave it there, but I would ask you to join me in welcoming Ben and to thank him so much for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks so much for such a generous introduction, Aoife. And my thanks to the Child Rights group here at Doughty Street as well. Tonight I'm going to talk on the basis of my experience as the Special Rapporteur rather than in my academic capacity, and also reflecting on the kinds of issues that we've been seeing in counterterrorism and children's rights over the last little while. It does feel like child rights, like human rights generally, are in really significant retreat worldwide, except I should say at my home in Sydney, where I have an 8-year-old, and he is trying to convince me there's an unqualified right to watch the iPad for an unlimited period of time. And I'm trying to teach him about necessary and proportionate restrictions on rights, but not having success. Recent years, what I'd like to do today is in the first part talk a little bit about children's rights in armed conflict involving so-called terrorist groups or actual terrorist groups. And then in the second part, move into the domestic legal area and identify 6 or 7 trends we're seeing in our work with governments in what's going on in domestic law and practice. In conflict, recent years have been terrible for children. I mean, they are doubly victimized by terrorist groups as well as state violations in the name of counter-terrorism, alongside all kinds of proxy actors fighting alongside states. Terror and state terror against children are part of a new wave of really extreme counter-terrorism laws and practices. Not just counter-terrorism, but also, I should say, this relatively new language of preventing and countering violent extremism, and in some countries, just extremism without the violent attached. These are emerging legal categories. And this all comes at a time, a bleak time of attacks on human rights, the human rights system, and human rights mechanisms writ large, making it even harder to push back against these inroads on rights. I do think there are signs of hope, though, and I'll try to be a little bit optimistic along the way. So with conflict, I mean, firstly, of course, we have to start with Gaza. I mean, in the last 2 years, the statistics suggest over 20,000 children have been killed, 42,000 injured, of which about half are left with significant disabilities. Over 150 dead from starvation and malnutrition, and those who are alive, having experienced malnutrition, may have lifelong developmental and health complications. 40,000 children have lost one or both parents, which humanitarians are referring to as a new category of, quote, wounded child, no surviving family, as they count the statistics. And then, of course, intergenerational trauma, which isn't being treated at present in the territory. About 1 million children are displaced. On top of that, of course, apocalyptic destruction of physical infrastructure, livelihoods, public services, suspending the ability of children to develop and prosper. Almost 700,000 children have had no education or almost no education formally for 2 going into 3 years. And 97% of schools have been damaged or destroyed. On top of that, of course, there have been ongoing killings of children in the West Bank, significant injuries, demolition of houses, separation of families, closure of UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem because of Israel's ban on cooperation with UNRWA. Hundreds of Palestinian children have been placed in administrative or criminal detention, which is a practice spanning many, many years of thousands of children detained by Israeli security forces, usually without access to family contact or legal assistance, sometimes subject to abuse and humiliation. Now, all of this, of course, the fact that there's been such impunity for this signals to other states that there are no consequences for starving children, obliterating their societies and their families, and returning us to a kind of scorched earth era of colonial counterinsurgency. Of course, the wider counterterrorism landscape in the region is also one of impunity, harming children. Daily ceasefire violations in Lebanon, illegal preventive wars in Iran and Syria, attacks on Yemen, which have violated humanitarian law and endangered children. There's an office within the UN called the Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. And her office tracks 6 what we call grave violations, so key children's rights that are counted around the place. And new records were set in the last year, over 41,000 grave violations of children's rights worldwide, half by armed groups, half by states. And these are roughly killing, maiming, denial of humanitarian access, recruitment of children, more than 7,000 children recruited, abductions, and many illegal or arbitrary detentions. And the majority of these are in conflicts involving terrorist conflicts. So Palestine, Somalia, Nigeria, DRC, which is Congo, which is a mix of ISIS now, as well as other rebel groups, Lebanon, Burkina Faso, Mozambique, 35% increase in sexual violence against children in over the previous year. And that, of course, despite all the underreporting of sexual and gender-based violence that we know is par for the course. As part of my mandate, I undertake official country visits, and in the last year have been focusing heavily on Africa. So most recently, I was in Somalia, before that Benin and Cote d'Ivoire. And just to give you a snapshot in Somalia as one example, displacement of civilians, and usually the majority are women and children, is an extraordinary human rights problem in the counterterrorism context. There are about 3.5 million internally displaced people in Somalia, but they're not in, neatly organized, serviced UN refugee camps. Most of them are in almost 4,000 informal sites, which have very little infrastructure, public services, few NGOs, few UN actors involved. And 80% are women and children. Chronic insecurity in the camps because of not just state security forces being a risk, Al-Shabaab, of course, clan militias, civilian proxy forces, and huge numbers of cases of sexual and gender-based violence against children. Many have been displaced multiple times because of the ebb and flow of the conflict, coupled with climate change impacts, clan conflicts, natural disasters. And on top of that, the government, because people often settle on private or public land, the government often evicts people, causing yet again another wave of displacement. Most of these IDPs are acutely short on shelter, water, sanitation, food, healthcare, education. Families are separated. on top of physical insecurity, very few livelihood opportunities to get out of poverty, and huge vulnerabilities to exploitation, recruitment by criminal gangs, terrorist groups, human traffickers, and so on. Often you find many cases of persons with disabilities which just get no access to any kind of service or treatment. This is not a Somalia example, but I remember a few years ago I was on the Turkish-Syrian border, and this was probably the most distressing case I've seen actually in my career working in this area. There was a Syrian family just living across the border, about 13 or 14 people living in a very small house informally. And as we walked into the front yard, there were a few trees, there were chickens and dogs, and then in the dirt was an 8-year-old boy chained to a tree. He lived outdoor with the animals. He had a profound mental disability. He was rocking back and forth, incredibly distressed. He was biting his legs. He was covered in sores and his own excrement. As we came in, he was kind of wailing and crying. And so his brother comes over and whacks him across the head. And it was an example of where social structures, supports back in Syria had completely broken down because of the poverty and experience of displacement from the terrorist conflict in Syria. Had no support from any kind of services. Luckily, because we were there, we managed to get Turkish Child Services and UNHCR to remove him from the family within a few days. But you can think of countless examples like this, which would never be detected and never get the kind of support that they need. Denial of the right to education is something, I mean, I'm a bit of a socioeconomic rights fan as an academic, and on the right to education, this is something that I think people don't instinctively think about. I mean, physical harm, of course, conflict-related violence, sexual, gender-based violence. But the right to education has such magnifying effects in violating cascading rights. In all of these places, I've been in West Africa, Somalia, Palestine, it's almost always the case that there is no or very little formal education available for students. Education is disrupted for a ton of reasons. I mean, it's because of violence, displacement, military misuse of schools to conduct hostilities, abduction of children to serve in armed groups or state forces, co-option of the curriculum to radicalize and preach extremist indoctrination. So lots of pressures on the education system. Now, we know under human rights law, even in emergencies, states have an obligation, and even in armed conflict, an obligation to maintain accessible, affordable, quality education in the usual way. And it's not just so that children can expand their life opportunities and make the most of their lives. It's also because in the counter-terrorism area, education is one of the best preventive factors for children to avoid radicalization and recruitment and susceptibility to violent extreme messages by terrorist groups. And if you feel hopeless, if you you're just feeling aggrieved for lack of opportunity, lack of education, livelihood, you feel neglected by the state. One of when we talked so in Mogadishu, I met with 1,200 Al-Shabaab prisoners in the Mogadishu Central Prison. And one of the reasons a lot of them give for joining Al-Shabaab is not actually jihad or anything like this. It's just fact that they had no opportunities. They had no school. They had no livelihood opportunities. Al-Shabaab offered them a salary. And it's a way of clawing out of poverty in a very difficult environment. So education is absolutely vital, and that's where we're falling down so often in the conflict area. I would mention, though, something that's come up in our country visits. It's also been the importance of regulating education well. So it's not enough just to provide it. In northern Benin and northern Cote d'Ivoire, we came across Quranic schools, which basically exploit what are called talibé, who are essentially Quranic students, often from poor families, given up by their parents. They're sent out on the streets to beg, or they're involved in forced labor. They're extremely vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. The imams are often trained in extreme places in the Gulf and then come home. And for a long time, these were totally unregulated spaces. And so the message we have been working with these governments on is to ensure that you have a minimum public quality curriculum delivered in those schools, including in a national language. You've got to get the balance right. You know, obviously parents also under human rights law have a right to choose their children's education, including to choose religious education, and you don't want the state interfering too much in that. So it's about getting the balance right. And on that front, I mean, there are equally risks of over-securitization, and we will soon send a formal communication to the UK government about its PREVENT program, which I know we'll hear more about tonight. One area where I think there is certainly overreach in the education system. I mean, one statistic that struck me, and I'm aware of the interim reviewer of PREVENT's recent report, giving it a fairly clean bill of health, which was a bit of a surprise to me. He wasn't very complimentary about UN special rapporteurs or human rights NGOs either. But the standout statistic for me is of the 7,000 referrals, 50% in the previous year, 57% of which were children, and so often driven through the education system. Of them, only 7% were taken up by channel in the formal process for dealing with these risks. Now, of course, other cases are diverted in other parts of the system, which are less invasive. But it does say to me that health professionals, education professionals, etc., authorities that are under the PREVENT duty are really over-reporting in a massive way for fear of the various compliance consequences if they don't report. And this is resulting in referring people who should not be referred, fundamentally. And on top of that, of course, we know all about the discrimination, etc. concerns. So education is one I think states need to focus a lot more upon. Now, all of these developments in armed conflicts are occurring. I mean, they're bad enough, but of course, they're occurring in a rapidly deteriorating international environment for human rights and defending human rights and international norms. I point to a few factors that are making our work very difficult at the moment. Number one is the collapse in humanitarian funding from not only the US, but also Europeans rearming against Russia. I felt this starkly in Somalia, where in the space of 6 months, foreign aid collapsed by 70% in Somalia. And so, for example, in the whole country, there were only 3 rape crisis centers operating before the cuts. Now there are none. They've all closed. And when I spoke to the Minister for Women, I said, how much does one of these things cost to run? She said, 20,000 US a year. I mean, this is peanuts, right? And yet, if you're a girl raped by Al-Shabaab or a Somali army man, you've got nowhere to go. I mean, even a basic rape kit is now no longer available. Secondly, there's a shrinking of humanitarian space due to physical attacks on humanitarian, legal obstruction of humanitarian action, counter-terrorism financing and NGO laws restricting the ability of humanitarians to move money and resources, attacks on United Nations institutions like UNRWA, attacks on my colleague Francesca Albanese, the Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, attacks on the International Criminal Court. Thirdly, there's a drawdown of UN peace operations. So the Somali African Union peace mission, which is one of the important factors standing between Mogadishu and an Al-Shabaab takeover, is out of money. I mean, 300 million was ripped out of the budget by the Americans. No one else is stumping up the cash. There's a real concern that operation may draw down massively or even end, and al-Shabaab already controls half the country and is making gains. When I was there, we had weekly rocket attacks on the UN compound. I was due to meet the head of national intelligence. He calls me up, says, "Mate, sorry, I got to cancel. My convoy just came under attack. My guard was killed. One of my cars was blown up. There was a suicide attack in Mogadishu when we were there. Old bloke walks amongst 17-year-olds lining up to join the Somali army. Blows 20 of them to pieces in a suicide bombing. It's an incredibly dangerous environment because of and being made worse because of the lack of international assistance. And that's quite apart from no appetite in the Security Council to do any new peace missions and a complete dysfunction and paralysis of collective security. On top of all of that, I'd say there's a liquidity crisis at the UN. So all kinds of UN agencies, including the humanitarians, slashing 20%, could well be more. I'd say 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are now just bad actors on human rights. The US is it's just in recent weeks murdered 57 civilians on 14 civilian boats, killing so-called narco terrorists. This is mass murder. Today I made the call that I think it's on the way to being a crime against humanity. It's a systematic attack on a civilian population, and almost no government has said anything about it. And this is what I find a really shocking sign of the times. At least in the first war on terror, lots of people spoke up about the torture papers and military commissions and illegal renditions. Apart from a couple of countries in Latin America whose citizens have been killed by this, nobody is everybody's afraid to speak out against the Americans. Here in the UK, backsliding on Palestine Action, something which I know some of you have been following. And then, of course, actors like China trying to completely co-opt the human rights system. I'll tell you a side note from a brutal meeting I had yesterday with China in Geneva. I spent a year fundraising for my special rapporteurship because we get next to no money from the UN. So it's all, we just have to find what we can. China was the only country which came up with money and gave me enough to fund a full-time legal advisor in New York, who's about 6 months into the job. Last Wednesday, I presented my latest report to the General Assembly on administrative measures, this super nerdy topic, administrative measures in counter-terrorism. But in a footnote, I mention, there's a part which deals with administrative security detention, as well as measures to prevent violent extremism. And so, of course, I cite the UN Human Rights report on Xinjiang and the detention camps there. China goes nuts in New York. Beijing sends an instruction to Geneva informing me yesterday that essentially, because I criticize China, I will never receive any funding ever again from China, and accusing me of all kinds of other things. But their expectation is by giving you money, you buy silence. That's absolutely, and I knew a time would come eventually where I would say something about China and that money would end. But I didn't think it would be because of a footnote. It wasn't even me alleging they were doing anything. It was just citing something someone else had said. On top of this, I'd say a real inability of the international community to deal with root causes driving conflict that kills children in large numbers. And I think Gaza is a really good example of this. There's a global counterterrorism strategy, which pillar 1 of which calls on states to address the conditions conducive to terrorism, so-called root causes. It's a very poorly implemented part of the strategy, by the way, because a securitized, militarized approach to counterterrorism prevails over peacemaking, peace building, justice, development, etc. And I think the Gaza peace plan is a perfect example of this. Yes, everybody's relieved that the killing has stopped, but it fundamentally doesn't address the root causes. It doesn't guarantee any pathway to self-determination, statehood, self-governance, Palestinian control of their own lives, including their own economy. It substitutes one occupation with another. It treats Gaza in isolation from the West Bank, doesn't address illegal settlements, borders, refugees, compensation, all the things you need to tackle to have a permanent solution. It ignores almost completely the International Court of Justice last year, calling for essentially an immediate withdrawal, not a conditional one, depending upon what the United States and Israel would like. It sidelines the United Nations Security Council and instead comes up with some strange yet to be determined international security force. It preserves the status quo and seriously risks, of course, the long-term resumption of violence. And above all, what shocked me the most when we responded to this was that it says absolutely nothing about accountability and justice, as if the suffering of victims of international crimes on either side counts for nothing. I mean, Hamas has been given a blanket immunity, essentially, under this deal, let alone any action on the Israeli side. And of course, we know there can be no peace without justice according to law or without recognizing Palestinian lives as equally worthy of dignity and respect. Now, in a moment, I just want to bring in my dear colleague Zainab in Lebanon. This state impunity for violations of fundamental international rules, enabled by a ton of bystander states, facilitated by the weapons suppliers like the US and Germany, has of course encouraged Israel to break the law more and more over the years. As I mentioned, I think the Gaza campaign is far worse than the first US war on terror. It's got some of the same characteristics. So there's just simple law breaking and vengeance and dehumanization, murder, torture, human shields, all that kind of thing. But there's also the same kind of creative, fabricated, unethical lawyering that went on to defend, torture and renditions and so on the first time around. So Israel has been, for example, stretching who is considered to be taking a direct part in hostilities. Stretching how many civilian casualties can be tolerated in a strike, 20 civilians for one low-level Hamas fighter, destroying whole apartment buildings, whole families, in order to attack a tunnel system, high explosive munitions in densely populated areas, razing homes, suburbs, cities, to make the fight against terror slightly more convenient for the Israelis and slightly less harmful for their soldiers, deploying AI to accelerate targeting without adequate human supervision, justifying attacks on schools, hospitals, humanitarians, and infrastructure on the pretext of countering terrorism justifies everything. I think one incident which really captured a lot of this for me was the pager attack, which I'll ask Zainab to speak on in just a moment. This was presented as a clinical targeted strike on alleged Hezbollah operatives. But in reality, we called it out as an indiscriminate attack because it, of course, could not be known who held each of the 3,000 devices at the time they were detonated or how many civilians would be in the vicinity, even if you could be assured that when they were given out in the first place, they were actually given to Hezbollah, and not just Hezbollah fighters, remembering it's a very large and complex organization. This ghoulish golden pager statue presented by Netanyahu to Trump was this kind of celebration of Israeli ingenuity and technological triumph. But Zainab did some deep investigative work and tracked down some of the child victims of those attacks, who she'll talk to you about. Zainab's an investigative photojournalist. She's a filmmaker. She's worked on many conflicts in the region. She's gone to great lengths to gain the trust of the children and their families. And she's joining us now to share the truth that she has uncovered in those attacks. Over to you, Zainab. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Hello, everyone. I'm here to speak about the attack that happened last year on the 17th of September, 2024. Going to share my screen just in a second. No. Okay. So, it was the first day of private schools in Lebanon, across Beirut, Bekaa, and the south. Many had taken first day photos that morning. You can see proud smiles, new beginnings. Hours later, everything changed. Welcome to Operation Grim Beaker, which Israel described as the most precise attack in history. On that day, 15 children across Lebanon were affected. 2 lost their lives instantly. 13 were maimed, losing one or both eyes, their fingers torn away, their bodies burnt and scarred, and the ages of the child victims ranged from infants to 17-year-olds. Amongst these children, I personally interviewed 7. Many people have asked me, why were the children carrying pagers in the first place? Well, the answer is simple. These were ordinary communication devices used by their parents. The children were at home when the pager started beeping strangely, but just back from the first day of school. They picked them up as any child would, took them to their parents, and then everything went dark. Now, to understand the context of this attack, it's important to clarify who the targeted individuals were. In Lebanon, a number of social, medical, and educational institutions operate under large community networks, some of which are affiliated with Hezbollah and its wider social structures. These institutions, however, are officially registered within the Lebanese state and provide essential civilian services such as healthcare, education, and social assistance. Many of the adults who possessed the pagers on the day of the attack were not combatants. They included healthcare workers, engineers, and administrative employees working within these civilian institutions. The use of pagers was widespread across different professional sectors as a basic mean of coordination and communication. Possessing such a device does not make an individual a combatant, nor does it remove the protection or their protection under international humanitarian law. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel and civilian workers remain protected from attack unless they take direct part in hostilities. In this case, there is no evidence that any of the victims were engaged in any military activity at the time of the explosion. Also, the detonations occurred in public spaces, in homes, hospitals, streets, civilian neighborhoods, and markets, etc., where individuals were carrying out normal daily activities. Even if some of the victims may have been members of an armed group, international humanitarian law makes clear that a person is only considered a lawful military target while directly participating in hostilities, which when individuals are not actively fighting or off duty or dressed in civilian clothing while performing ordinary civilian acts, they are not lawful targets. But this tragedy did not begin in 2024. Munitions hidden in everyday objects are part of a much older pattern in Lebanon. When I was little, I remember the Lebanese army visiting our schools, warning us not to pick any toys or any objects from the ground because they might explode. Since the 1990s, dozens of Lebanese children have been killed or maimed by toys and ordinary items rigged by Israel with explosives. And this practice has been documented by multiple international reports. Now, over the past months, I have traced and met some of those survivors. The thread is clear. These are some of the child victims of the 1990s booby-trapped objects. As we can see, it is a pattern of warfare that repeatedly turns civilians and particularly children into targets. From booby-trapped objects in the 1990s to exploding pagers in 2024, the tactic remains the same, only the technology has evolved. Now, why is it important to speak about this now or before? Because impunity has consequences, simply. Now, when I asked Maryam, who is one of the child victims back in 1997, to share some photos from her visit to Geneva, where she was invited to speak about her experience after finding the rigid toy, she paused for a moment and said, "What is the point?" For her, nothing has changed since she spoke at the Children's Rights event back in the 1998. Decades later, she still carries the same scars, and in her words, if the world did not listen then, why would it listen now? 35 years of Israeli weaponizing ordinary objects have passed, and justice has never been served. When children grow up knowing that their suffering brings no justice, they might grow up losing faith in the system. And today, 2 children lost their lives, and 13 live without sight, without fingers, without normal childhood. Their parents do not ask for pity, they ask for justice, because every time we ignore crimes, we allow them to be repeated. And these children are not awaiting sympathy, by the way. Today, they are learning to live again. They are relearning to write, to draw, to read, to play music, to ride a bicycle, and much, much more. This is not only a story of tragedy, it is one of extraordinary resilience. And when you speak with the children, you will be shocked of how strong and well-spoken they are. Now, when we speak about child protection in war, we often talk about education, trauma, and recovery. But what about accountability? Now, today I'm here to tell the world that these children are not numbers on a casualty list. Each has a name, a face, a family, and a dream. These stories are not just about Lebanon, they're about the world we are all shaping, a world where technology evolves faster than morality and where precision no longer means accuracy, but rather the precise destruction of innocence. Thank you. Let me just stop.
Thanks so much, Zainab, for your wonderful story and for your courage and telling the stories that we didn't read about in the mainstream media when this happened. And Zainab's working on a film about these issues over the coming year. Now we've got about, I think, 7 minutes left, something like this. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just give you the highlights of the key trends we have been observing in domestic counterterrorism law and practice on children. And we do have a paper on this, which we can share with you. It's on our website, which gives you the detail. Firstly, in relation to the minimum age of criminal responsibility for terrorism offences, you know that the Committee on the Rights of the Child recommends it should be at least 14 years, preferably 15 or 16. A majority of countries worldwide are still below 14 years, which is terrible in itself. But the pattern we're seeing is that whatever the age of criminal responsibility, there's an increasing number of states that lower that age for terrorism or national security offences. So the rationale goes that because these are such serious offences, somehow children should be held responsible, even though their age of maturity and culpability and responsibility is no different for terrorism versus shoplifting, right? I mean, you're as mature as you are. But this kind of hyper punitive approach, even as low as 10 in some countries, is one we have been very concerned about. Secondly, you know, of course, it's recommended that children should be processed through a dedicated juvenile justice system, not the regular adult criminal justice system. Couple of features we're seeing. Number one, children for terrorism offences being diverted into the adult criminal justice process as an exception from juvenile justice processes where they exist. This is true even in the United Kingdom, right? I mean, instead of youth court, they're tried as in the Crown Court as essentially adults. Second phenomenon we're seeing is children being put before special courts, special terrorism courts, national security courts, or even military courts. In Somalia, children are prosecuted before the military court in Puntland and in Mogadishu, even with 4 death penalties handed down against children in recent years. We know the Israeli system, military courts have jurisdiction, including over children as young as 12 years old. The third phenomenon we see is children being criminalized, so liability for offenses relating to their association with terrorist organizations or other members of terrorist organizations in circumstances where their conduct is mere association with family members, usually. And so instead of being prosecuted for harmful criminal conduct, murder, rape, attacks on civilians, etc., they're being prosecuted on the basis of they were living amongst, ISIS members, Al-Shabaab members, etc. On top of this, we're also seeing criminalization of conduct which absolutely ought not be treated as crimes, posting on social media, political protest, activism under offenses like glorification, apology, a new wave of this in the pro-Palestine protests over the last couple of years as well, of course. Number 4, under international law, of course, detention of children should be a last resort, exceptional, etc. Too many countries where we see children detained either on criminal charges or even administratively in circumstances where diversionary non-custodial processes should be available and should be used. Even the Security Council, which is not a great sponsor of human rights in our experience, has recommended there should be, rehabilitation, reintegration of family members. Prosecution, detention should not be the norm. One of the most shocking areas we focused on over quite a few years now is Northeast Syria. At one point up to 70,000 people detained there, mostly women and children. Now the population it's down to about 30,000 plus 9,000 mainly men in ISIS detention. The positive news is Iraq has undertaken to repatriate all of its people by 2027. Syria has just undertaken to repatriate or return Syrians to their homes, and already some hundreds have left the camps. Dragging the chain are the third country national states of nationality, including quite a few Western states. But the point about that is that we have assessed these detention conditions on a technical visit my predecessor did. UN Women did a report released in New York last week. Our assessment is this is cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. It's terrible for child development. It exposes them to terrorist recruitment and radicalization. And quite apart from the security risks of maintaining those camps. To their credit, the Americans are pushing very hard for all countries to repatriate their nationals, but still the kind of populist politics in a bunch of countries is preventing returns. There are some good practices. In Somalia, I'd say there's a deal with UNICEF that if children leave Al-Shabaab or ISIS, they're handed over to UNICEF. They go into a child protection process. They're not detained. They're generally not criminalized. And this is what we recommend should be emulated in other like situations. Number 5 is deviations from due process, fair trial procedures in child criminal justice. So limitations on or denial of access to lawyers, family, restrictions on disclosure of evidence, adequate facilities, time, etc., to prepare a defense. detention without judicial supervision for protracted periods. The MENA region, I'd say, is a particularly bad one. Egypt, Turkey, UAE, Israel. I mean, these constantly come up in our work. Final two, just briefly, at the end of the criminal process, disproportionate penalties, criminal penalties and sanctions. So not child-friendly approaches to sentencing. In some cases, even the death penalty. Chronic disproportionality in the heaviness of criminal sentences, imprisonment being granted. And throughout the detention process, of course, not child-friendly conditions of detention. The final one, just to mention, because this is what my report in New York was on last week, the growth of what we call administrative measures outside the criminal justice system. So from control orders to terrorist listing to prevent type interventions, citizenship stripping, denial of welfare benefits, exclusion from education. There are so many of these measures proliferating, and although they're intended to be preventive, not punitive, they absolutely can have punitive-like effects. They typically have even fewer due process protections and judicial safeguards than the criminal justice track. And of course, they have very serious consequences for family and child rights, social and economic rights, equality, discrimination, and privacy. So to conclude, yeah, I didn't give you much optimism. I know I promised that at the start. I'll give you one sentence of hope. These are turbulent times for protecting, and tough times for protecting human rights, including because of the drastic underfunding of human rights, humanitarian development, and peacemaking activities that prevent terrorism and violence. But I am still optimistic. I'm inspired by the many champions of human rights, including Zainab, who joined us, who work tirelessly worldwide, despite the pressures, including, I should say, and this has been one of the surprising experiences of the last 2 years as Special Rapporteur, actually a huge number of people in governments, public servants, who vehemently dislike the direction of travel of their government and want to make a difference. And one of the most useful things that my role does and that civil society does for people in that position is to empower them with arguments they can use within government so that they can take it to the security services or the intelligence services, the military, and fight the good fight. We encourage all governments to take concrete, effective measures to ensure respect for children's rights in counter-terrorism, to fight against impunity for terrorist and state perpetrators who violate children's rights, and to deliver hope and justice for children. Thank you.
I think that was, an absolute force. And there was optimism at the end, I mean, I think, you talk about so many things, this notion of this kind of scorched earth era of counterterrorism is a very powerful image, and the strong linkage you make between precarity, displacement, lack of opportunity, but also, which Zainab comes back to in her work as well, the issue of impunity, the issue of lack of justice, and the way in which they contribute to perhaps one's availability for involvement in or engagement in, terrorist-related activities, which one wouldn't be open to otherwise. I thought it was very powerful what you had to say about education, but also I think what you say here, you very much make the point that what I also appreciated was you very much located your comments in the broader context where you have this, as you say, collapse in humanitarian funding, which is crucial for children. The lack of, and what you refer to, this complete dysfunction in terms of collective responsibility. I mean, that's very powerful. It's what we're seeing, and it's an absolute breeding ground for human rights violations. And I thought, it was interesting for me to hear. We hear an awful lot about, lack of funding for the UN and this and that, but actually what you're talking about is on the ground services that support people. rather than perhaps elite institutions, which is not to suggest that, you know, direct attacks on UN Special Rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese and indirect attacks, such as China saying we pull your funding so that we can control your work, aren't very serious. But it's very, for me, I think that's very powerful where you're talking about it, what's happening on the ground and how that feeds into it. Those are just some very quick comments. I know that our panelists will pick them up, and I'd actually ask people to join us now, if that's okay, please. And I can get, I think we might need an extra chair. No? Yeah, we do need another chair. I'll bring one up, sorry. So if we can get, in no particular, I think we're missing a badge, are we? No, we're not, Fatima. We're not missing a chair because Fatima's online and I'm a complete moron. Sorry. So I think what we're going to do is, you have to go there. We're very lucky this evening, and because we're very lucky this evening in terms of the caliber, hello Fatima, very lucky this evening in terms of the caliber of people that we have joining us, because very different perspectives. We'll be hearing very different perspectives. We have Fatima, who has done, and just to give a very brief overview, I'm going to do the bios at the beginning. Dr. Fatima Ahdash, she's currently an assistant professor of law at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. But Fatima is an absolutely outstanding scholar in the area of, and the inadequately explored area, urgent area of national security law, family law, and child rights, and their various interactions. And her research is award-winning. She's a PhD from LSE. But in addition to her academic work, she has also worked with national and international NGOs in the area of national security and accountability with a child rights or child-centered lens. So Fatima will speak to us first. Our second speaker is Leo, who is the co-director of Child Rights International Network, where he leads on their law and policy work. And Leo has worked on children's rights in the context of counter-terrorism since 2012, which is an extremely long time. And we think, you know, when the focus on counter-terrorism, a child rights perspective, really is a relatively recent area, this is a really long, significant track record of effort in that area. And he's led the organization's global campaign to end the death penalty and life sentencing of children, and CRIN's recent international survey on counter-terrorism legislation and forthcoming publication to protect or punish children, counter-terrorism, and the criminal justice system, which I'm sure Leo will talk about.
I didn't write that one.
You didn't write that? Oh, well, I am so sorry. That is shocking, shocking. So apologies, I was doing it. Alistair, who's sitting at the front and did write the publications with us. So, but thank you. But I hope you will mention the publication. And then finally, a colleague here from Chambers, Maryam, who is a member of Doughty Street with exceptional expertise in criminal matters, including terrorism issues, again. And in addition to her very extensive experience at the bar, she has worked on high-profile terrorism cases during her secondment with Reprieve, representing leaders of political parties sanctioned as terrorists by the UN, US, and UK. She was part of a team that brought the first due process challenge to the US against the inclusion of a US citizen on a kill list while reporting on the conflict in Syria. And she has been involved in a whole range of cases tackling directly the issue of extrajudicial killing by drones and mercenaries. And she also assists individuals challenging their listing by the UN Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee. So a really wide range of experience and different engagements with law and counter-terrorism, both nationally and internationally there. But what I'm going to do now is to that sets the scene for it, but I'm now going to hand over to Fatima to maybe give us her response and her thoughts following Ben's lecture. Is that okay, Fatima?
Yeah, thank you, Aoife. Could you all hear me?
Yeah.
Good, wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you to Professor Ben Saul for an incredibly informative and also, I think, really touching lecture. I'm going to kind of really look at one angle today, and that is what I kind of see as the increasing securitization of childhood. And I'm looking at it from more of an academic kind of perspective or lens, because I know people much sort of better versed than I am will be looking at it from the kind of rights perspective and the practice perspective. So I'd just like to start by saying that actually children have always been kind of impacted by both terrorism and state responses to terrorism. As the Palestinian feminist theorist Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian argues, the different ways in which the socialization, education, welfare, and intimate lives of children very much matter and mattered within colonial ideologies and also the violent practices of modern securitized societies and states. So security laws and policies often have directly targeted children, stripping them of their childhood in ways that unchild them. And this concept of unchilding was coined by Nadira Shalhoub-Kavoukian and is really helpful in understanding, I think, the nexus, the security childhood nexus. Because what happens when childhood is securitized, when children are targeted by national and international security measures, what happens is that they're no longer treated as children. They're kind of converted into security threats. And these practices of unchilding can be found wherever state security practices converge with colonial and settler colonial legacies in ways that kind of target and particularly seek to regulate suspect communities. So the point I'm trying to make is that children and childhood have never really been absent from national security practices and discourses, but as Professor Ben Saul kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, in the last decade or so, children and childhood have come to kind of be present in and to kind of be visible in counterterrorism practices and discourses in much more stark and I would say unprecedented ways, with an explosion of kind of criminal and non-criminal laws and policies that directly target children, their education, their welfare, their intimate kind of private lives, their friendships, their mental health and their well-being in the name of national security. And I think this has happened in a way that has constructed the child not just as kind of a subject of the counter-terrorist state, but in many ways as the main subject of the counter-terrorist state. So children, the way I see it, are no longer kind of just part of the background emotional scenery that's weaponized to justify state security practices. In many ways, they're kind of the main show. And how did we get here? Well, my thesis, my argument would be that there's been kind of almost a childification of counterterrorism that kind of well and truly began in the wake of 9/11 and the different iterations of the war on terror that we've had. And you know, if we go back to the first iteration of the war on terror, the military face of the war on terror was partly presented as an effort to kind of restore global childhood innocence, particularly global girlhood in Afghanistan, for example. And so within the counterterrorism context, we find age-old kind of Euro-American anxieties or Eurocentric anxieties about childhood intertwining with Orientalist and reductive representations of children as either kind of hapless victims or dangerous potential terrorists with nothing very much kind of in between. And in my work, I've mostly focused on kind of this new emerging legal category, the idea of childhood radicalization. So it's not just radicalization, but it's childhood radicalization that has emerged in the last kind of decade or so since the rise of ISIS. And with it, again, an explosion in the number of kind of ostensibly soft counterterrorism measures that are couched in welfarist terms. And so these measures are not just kind of presented as national security measures. They're actually first and foremost conceptualized and marketed as measures that safeguard children from the abuse that it can happen through radicalization and extremism. And with that comes obviously the prevent strategy as it's practiced, you know, in the UK in schools, but lots of other kind of measures and practices as well, where there's a blurring of the distinction between child welfare and national security. So increasingly states present counterterrorism as child protection and child protection as counterterrorism in a way that kind of allows for the overlapping of the logic of security and the logic of welfare, such that security is welfare and welfare is security. And that's very convenient for states for a number of reasons, kind of most primarily, it's easy, right, to justify very intrusive practices, very intrusive state security practices as safeguarding measures, because childhood innocence sells. It sells really well, and it's really hard to critique measures that are kind of marketed as there to safeguard childhood innocence. So what I'm kind of putting forward is that we need to deconstruct a little bit this kind of safeguarding, I would say almost propaganda that comes around counterterrorism practices, and that packages them as ordinary safeguarding and child protection measures when they are anything but. I think, yeah, so I know I only have 5 minutes. I don't know if I've gone past that. I'm sorry if I have, but that was really my intervention. Thank you so much, Aoife.
Mary, I just, Fatima, I think it's purely because of timing. It is absolutely fascinating. I think we'd all have listened to it all day. I mean, really, that was absolutely so interesting. And I know we'll come back to it in Q&A. And I know there may be other things you want to touch on. So of course we can deal with those in the Q&A now. I'm now going to quickly pass over to Leo, who will give his input before turning to Maryam. But thank you so much, Fatima. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Aoife, and thank you, Fatima. I could talk about that forever as well, and hopefully we get a chance in the Q&A. I wanted to pick up on a few trends, reflecting on some of what Ben said that we see from our own work. And the first is this idea of counterterrorism law as punching holes in existing protections with regards to children's rights. And if we look at child justice systems in particular, internationally and nationally, we see a lot of this. At one end, the most extreme end of the spectrum, we see issues around the death penalty for offences committed by children. The move towards abolition on that front has been very close to successful, but in the holdouts that we see, there are 4 countries who have executed children in the last decade, or rather executed people for offences committed as children in the last decade. And if you look at the laws that exist in those states, you see a very strong connection with counterterrorism law. We see sometimes national security offences necessarily taking that sentence, and others where there is an explicit exception to existing sentencing for children for national security offences. If we move down to less extreme cases, we see, again, children being tried as adults, being excluded from well-established existing child protection procedures, sentencing, and being excluded from the diversion measures that would otherwise be accessible to them were they tried and convicted of any other offence. And this logic feeds right down to, we're getting this to prevent. It's not possible to talk about this without talking about prevent, I'm sorry. And there we see a flipping of the usual well-established practices that exist with regards to child justice systems. We see the policy there has for a very long time been well accepted that if you can keep children out of the formal justice system for as long as possible and support them through that process, you can avoid the worst outcomes. Most children grow out of behavior that is problematic if you give them the opportunity to do so. And with prevent, we see that approach being flipped, in that we see children being drawn into procedures or measures that, that aren't criminal of their nature, but are managed and coordinated through policing practices. So we've gone from keep children out of the criminal justice system, even for criminal behavior, to drawing them in for non-criminal behavior. The second area that I want to talk about is the ways that counterterrorism law can be skewed to fit gaps that it's not well designed for. And we're talking about this in the UK, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that public services in the UK are very, very stretched. Mental health services for children in particular are in many areas non-existent. And one of the features that we're seeing operate through prevent is that professionals working with children are forced to turn to it as the only route to gain access to services. And it's difficult not to feel horror at that. I think if we look at the situation of a teacher who is faced with a child who is clearly having difficulties, and the only way that they can get a rapid response to that is through a prevent referral. And a prevent referral is a mechanism that's meant to deal with children being potentially drawn into terrorist activity. That's not a suitable response, and it has come from a place of not having adequate services available through other routes. The final point that I wanted to touch on is evidence and transparency. And I think here we're seeing a real failure of governments to make the case for why the measures they've chosen are working. And if the public are going to have faith in these measures, some of which come with real costs to children and members of society, there is an obligation to make that argument and to make it with transparency. As Aoife very kindly mentioned, we've just published a report that's looking at how children experience the criminal justice system everywhere from pre-criminal space through trial processes through to rehabilitation. And we tried to piece together the information that you can get out of the state in this. We put forward all of the FOI requests you can possibly think of, challenged many of them through the ICO complaints procedure, and sometimes they tell us they don't have the evidence, sometimes they just don't want to give it to us. And this just isn't good enough. It really isn't. If these measures are necessary, we need to be able to have access to enough information to assess their effectiveness. And if we can't have that, that is a profound failing on the part of the government. So I'm going to draw to a close there with a plea for not just a rights-based approach, but an evidence-based approach and enough information to be able to tell if that is the case.
Thank you so much, Leo. Marvelous. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to Maryam, who is our final panelist. Things that have already been said. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So I wanted to offer a brief insight into the way that the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza has affected children in a domestic context here in the UK, and specifically through the way in which community discourse about the situation in Palestine is discussed by children in schools, and with that, with what consequences. Particularly where the consequences of that are lead them into the criminal justice system, where I practice as a criminal defence barrister. So I advise a number of grassroots charities in the last 18 months or so, alongside my colleague in Chambers, Taiba Bajwa, who by virtue of a need, meaning specifically those charities communicating with us that there are parents facing needing support because their children have gone into school and made a comment about something that has happened during the course of conversations that have happened at home. They've told their friends or teachers, or they've asked an honest question in the way that children do. Why are you still drinking Coke, miss? Don't you know that they contribute to genocide? And as the child of parents who grew up, during the course of the South African apartheid and went to school wearing a badge saying I boycott South African goods in year 2, I was well equipped to deal with those kinds of conversations. But what about children whose parents, for example, don't speak English as a first language, or who haven't got that kind of communication open with school or at all? And what we've seen is that there has been an increase in the number of prevent referrals, exactly the way that Leo just set out, with educators feeling either too poorly equipped or obliged to make that kind of referral, and because they're readily or too readily outsourcing that communication and that educational opportunity to government agencies that criminalise children, rather than being prepared and encouraged and ready to have learning and informed debate for children in schools. And so children as young as 5 or 6 might find themselves cornered by a teacher under the guise of safeguarding. And the reality is that as we all know, the Gazan genocide has been played out through mobile phones. Families are attending protests, there's boycotting happening, and children are hearing these conversations. And as children tend to do, they go and test it out at school. And they'll have those conversations unabashedly in the way that they will. But the Department for Education stance is unequivocal. Schools must operate a position of what was coined quite soon after the 7th of October, the guidance that was published, of political neutrality. What does that mean in practice for children who are asking these difficult questions? Well, the focus on the Department for Education's guidance was the need for staff and school leaders to be alert and vigilant against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but failing completely to offer any resources or guidance on schools on how to encourage fruitful, healthy debate and teach children how to deal with these world events that are happening. And perhaps simultaneously and perhaps hypocritically, children are told to show kindness and empathy for those around them and for the world that they operate in. It's by and large left to the individual teacher or head teacher or staff member to decide how to approach an individual situation. So more likely than not, and from what I had seen in the communications I've had with these grassroots organisations, there's an approach either directly to the child, often without discussion with their parents at all,
remove that scarf, take off that keffiyeh, take off that badge or wristband. We don't wear those badges in school. So it might go entirely undetected by their parents, and the child might simply accept that erasure of their expression by an adult in a position of authority and a sort of Milgram-esque sort of expertise. Or it may escalate further by teachers initiating a conversation with the parents in which they ask them to justify what exactly have you said to this child? Do you think it's appropriate to talk to this child about a genocide? And what have you actually told them? Sort of a pseudo investigation by the head teacher. And then we receive emails asking for guidance because the parents are panicked that they're going to be referred themselves, or in fact criminalised themselves for a membership of a Palestine Action Group, because it's happened now post-prescription. And so the parents are schooled with this really baffling and quite troubling conundrum in which they are both really poorly equipped to navigate just how far state interference with education and teachers and pupils are afraid. And so the slightest miscommunication can mean that you find children really rapidly criminalised. Very briefly, what happens when they end up in the criminal justice system, whether it's for membership of a group or because they have disseminated a piece of information through their WhatsApp group with their mates? Well, what happens is that the criminal justice system is just as poorly equipped. Last year, with the late Isabella Forshaw, King's Counsel, a member of this chambers, I was part of a case called the Crown against ZA. It was a case involving a 14-year-old charged with murder. The Old Bailey routinely has young people charged with murder before it. And it was a case in which Mrs. Justice May found that there were routine failures to look after children within the criminal justice system. We found that, in fact, not only were experienced criminal judges sitting at the Old Bailey getting it wrong, but the system is so fundamentally poorly designed for young people. An example was that in that case, the young person was woken up at 6:30 every morning, transported without breakfast, without a shower to court, made to sit in a glass dock for 3 hours and expected to concentrate, not able to see his barrister, me and Isabella, during the breaks because there wasn't enough Serco staff that day, and so would go the whole day without having had any proper communication without his legal team. And these were routine failures. It was sort of like a litany of failures that had happened before ZA came to the point of sentencing, at which he was then slapped with a very lengthy sentence until it was reduced on appeal. And so multiple failings, and what do we do to fix it? Well, we keep speaking up when it's time to speak up. We don't let these systems squash the desire of children to ask those difficult questions and to be treated as growing people rather than, as Mrs. Justice May said, mini adults. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. Now, because we began 10 minutes late, we are going to finish 10 minutes late. I appreciate some people may need to go, but I haven't been generous at the beginning so that people get here. I think we really want to get full time because obviously, and also, sorry, if Zainab, if you're still here, do you mind turning, and Fatima, do you mind turning your cameras on at this point, just in case there's questions for you? Fantastic, there's Fatima, and wonderful. Thank you both so much. Okay, I'm going to take questions. I'm going to take a number of questions in a row. We have very limited time. I do not want 5 minutes. This is probably a comment, right? Short and sweet, all right? And I have confidence in everyone in the room, but I will brutally interrupt because I want to take 3 rapid fire questions now. So very quickly, who's going to start us off? Keelan, go on. I can see you're shifting in your chair. Sorry.
Well, first of all, absolutely brilliant event, incredibly moving, and that is a comment, but I hope it's allowed.
That's okay.
Yeah, I did want to ask the panel on what more they think could be done in relation to children being treated as perpetrators rather than victims of international human rights law abuses when they are recruited as child soldiers, when they're kidnapped and used as child soldiers. I wanted to ask if anyone had a comment on that issue specifically.
Thanks so much, Keelan. Can I take another comment there? This lady here at the front, please. Thanks. Right.
Thank you very much. Picking up the point about children as victims of terrorism, I'm wondering if the panel has views on why this aspect of counter-terrorism policy isn't as visible. And is it because of securitization dialogue that a lot of members of the panel have spoken about, or is it also due to capacity constraints and funding constraints? But yeah, about where is the space for children as victims?
I'm so sorry because I actually completely failed in my duties. I should have said earlier, Keelan Gallagher, who's a barrister here at Doughty Street. Do you mind saying who you are as well, please? Forgive me, just so we...
My name's Lucy Mason. I'm a lawyer from Freshfields.
Thank you so much. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, Lucy. That was totally my mistake. Wonderful. Okay, well, I don't see any other hands right at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over very quickly. I think probably children as victims of terrorism. I think perhaps Fatima, that one I will probably throw over to you for sure, if you're prepared to take it. But I'm first of all going to ask this issue of children being treated as perpetrators and raising the issue of, treatment of child soldiers, etc. And I think perhaps I sense that Ben and Leo may have thoughts around that topic. So Ben, if I can start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Great question. And Lucy, so nice to see you. Lucy used to work for the mandate, but Freshfields can pay a lot more than we can.
Oh, that's so mean.
Which was nothing. I think the Security Council drove a lot of the work on foreign terrorist fighters, and initially that was a hugely securitized process, and the idea was that anyone associated with a terrorist group should be, seen for prosecution, essentially. Over a period of time, they then realized actually sweeping up a ton of children, women, etc., who aren't perpetrators, who ought to be treated as victims. I do think there's still a real tension between the peacemaking side of the UN, which is DDR, so disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, which says you should be screened out of those processes only if you've committed an international crime or a serious crime like murder, but mere participation in an armed group should still render you eligible for rehabilitation, reintegration without prosecution. On the other hand, the Security Council approach, because it took this kind of membership of the group approach, and then some states interpreted that very, very widely, not to just include arms bearers, but anyone hanging out in a camp with ISIS or family members, and that tension still hasn't been resolved. And in fact, the UN's DDR standards have been developing a draft chapter on the interface between what we call PRR, prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration, which is the counter-terrorism side from the Security Council, and DDR, which is the traditional peacemaking kind of peace-building side. So that uneasy tension is playing out actually quite dangerously in some places. Somalia, I think, is a great example because essentially, any kid that surrenders, that voluntarily surrenders, is channeled through a DDR process. They're not prosecuted. UNICEF gets hold of them, and they're not sent to the courts. On the other hand, if you're captured on the battlefield and you're a kid, or you haven't defected to the government, but you've just kind of escaped Al-Shabaab and gone home, then you are still potentially liable for prosecution. And even in Puntland, these cases where people committed conduct when they were 16, 17, and by the time they were tried, they were 18, 19, and they were executed, 4 of them.
Leo, do you want to add?
Sure. I
Thanks so much.
agree with everything that Ben has just said, but I think people have found it quite difficult to make that mental shift. I think if we look at what's been in place in terms of seeing children as victims of other forms of exploitation, if you look at the steps that have gone forwards in terms of children exploited in sexual contexts or modern slavery, even where they might have committed crimes in modern slavery context, crimes in relation to the drug trade is very common. We've made this jump, so it's possible. But I think at the heart of the reason that a lot of people are wary of it comes from a place of fear, I think, and a sense that there isn't a great understanding of why children have been drawn into this kind of setting, and therefore there's a kind of a wall up there. And if I can I pick up on the question of victims in the other sense, because I think this is really interesting. Both children who have been used in terrorist groups or acts as victims, but also in terms of what are the rights of children who've been victims of terrorist attacks. How do we deal with the kind of support that they need through justice processes? There are some very active victim support groups there, but I don't think we have that as part of our conversation in the way that perhaps we should.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, can I get you to, sorry, thanks so much for that. I'm also going to hand over to Fatima to perhaps talk a little bit from your perspective and your research, Fatima, about why this notion of why children as victims of terrorism just gets less airtime, I suppose, in the general counter-terrorism discourse and space.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting question. I'm going to do that academic thing of sort of flipping the question a little bit and saying, I think that actually the idea of children as potential victims gets weaponized quite a lot in counterterrorism practices. And I think if we go back, there's always this kind of victim threat binary through which children are presented. So they're at risk, but they're also always risky at the same time. And it's kind of in the shift between these two categories that a lot of the harm happens, I think. So when they are seen as when children are seen as potential victims or victims of terrorism, they're at the same time they're also seen as potential perpetrators. So the very category of victim then gets kind of, as you correctly kind of pointed out, securitized into potential threat. And so I think there's almost a fear or concern about labeling a child as a potential victim of terrorism, because that also usually means, on the flip side, they're also a potential kind of threat at the same time. And I think far more concerning as children as potential victims of counter-terrorism. The state is kind of the biggest kind of violator of children's rights here is, to me, a lot more concerning and gets kind of much less attention paid to, especially when we look at it from the safeguarding perspective. We're always safeguarding children, or safeguarding frameworks. We're always safeguarding children from sort of non-state related issues. But what about safeguarding children from the very harms of the state, especially when it comes to the national security context? And finally, I just wanted to kind of emphasize the point that Leo was making as well, which is that I think if we look at this from a rights-based perspective, a children's rights approach, rather than a welfarist approach, we look at a terrorism from a child rights perspective as opposed to just a child welfare perspective, that might go some way towards remedying that gap in the conversation that you identified. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I know that Zainab doesn't want to come in. She's, I think, content to let the answer stand. There are other questions, other comments and thoughts. Sorry, may I get the microphone, please, Ray, to the lady here? Purple top. Sorry. And if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Yes, hi, my name's Diane Amon. I'm a professor. I've just moved to London and I'm visiting at UCL at the moment. And I want to thank you for a really great presentation. You've tracked a lot of things that have been trends, unfortunately, long since 9/11, and we go back and forth on the securitization of children, the targeting of children, et cetera. I guess I'd be curious what panelists feel is or are useful ways to apply pressure to push back at this moment, because at different moments, individual litigation, very important, but we always have questions about impact. During the Guantanamo era, there was a certain kind of litigation that seemed to be quite effective, as well as some of the other strategies that Professor Saul talked about. I'd be curious what you think is a way to push back against this at this moment. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks so much, Diane. I'm sorry to interrupt you because, of course, I know you've stunning experience in this area yourself, and have written such important stuff around children and international law generally. Other questions at this point? Other comments? Fine. Okay, I'm going to hand over then and see. Ben, would you?
Yeah, just briefly, the kind of interstate level, which is where I'm mostly focused, I'd say. There's a lot of talk amongst like-minded states now about how we encourage other states to build coalitions against the kind of bad actors in human rights. So there's a review of the global counterterrorism strategy coming up next year. Everybody's extremely worried how the OIC, Russia, China, some other spoilers will combine to basically strip out all the protective references in the review resolution to gender, human rights, civil society. At the moment, it's pretty much the European Union and Canada and a few others, and so we're trying to kind of seek out who are the positive states in Asia, Africa, Latin America, who traditionally might not have spoken up so much, but at this moment, every number in the room really counts. Also because the US is so unpredictable. I mean, the US, in New York, I have no counterpart because they fired him. And so I can't talk to the US on counterterrorism at the moment. Or if you have somebody, they don't have instruction from Washington, or the government, DC, deals directly with another capital and just cuts out the diplomats altogether. So there are these huge pressures on the multilateral system for pushing back. But there's certain, I mean, as I said, my experience, I've had some really productive engagements with African governments. So I think we can build new coalitions of countries that care about human rights.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben. I don't know, Leo, do you want to come in on that?
Perhaps briefly. I think it's an incredibly difficult moment to be talking about how we can push back. And I think the truth is that there isn't a silver bullet. I think we need to be trying lots of different things because a lot of them are going to fail. Certainly litigating where there are options there. There are moments and issues where even states who aren't very good on this issue, you find yourself aligned with them. The US has rather unexpectedly been very good about repatriation of children from Syria and has put its weight behind that. I struggle to think of any other issues where they're very helpful, but we have one there. And we look at the UK and I think there's a real absence of strategic decision-making around counterterrorism in the UK at the moment. But I think there are the chances that if we're able to find entry points around issues like justice reform, that we might be able to do some piecemeal work. So I think we have to be looking at all routes and accept that some of them are going to fail.
Thank you so much for that, Leo. Absolutely. Christy, can I?
Christy Clark, I'm a legal academic in Australia. Look, I realise I might be grasping at straws here a little bit, and it sort of builds on the last question, but I'm wondering if anyone has some tendrils of hope, some little things such as Somalia's, sort of program, but things which show us some possibility or some ways, because I think it's been observed that international law is not in a good place right now, but international law structures are not the only source of normative order. And I'm just wondering if there's any little tendrils that we could kind of take some hope from.
Can I say, just check if there's other questions? Perfect. And then I'm going to abuse my position as chair.
Rapporteur, who alluded to the Taliban and sort of Al-Majiri children in parts of West Africa being uniquely vulnerable to radicalization or recruitment by armed groups. But we're also seeing in West Africa from our partners that there's this trend where national security or kind of terror threats is being used as a rubric to justify street sweeps and mass arbitrary arrests and detention of children. And this kind of nexus with this anti-migrant sentiment being used to justify this really chilling sort of really weaponizing the identity of these irregular migrant children or children in street situations to justify the most like violent encroachment on their rights. And I just wonder if that's a trend you're witnessing more globally as well.
So much, Paul. As I said, I'm now, did you have a question? I'm so sorry. I'm going to abuse my position as chair just because I'm conscious that this will be the last round of questions. But we can of course continue over a glass of wine. I had a question for Zainab because I'm very interested in hearing more. I know you're working on a film, Zainab, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about it, the stage that it's at, who you're aiming, who your key target is for that film, how you've put it together, and also whether there's an opportunity to support the work that you're doing, given how important it is and the messaging it is. I also wanted to ask you, Maryam, given your engagements and your work with young people, do you find that there is, when you engage with people who are, for instance, having issues with regards to schools, etc., do you find that schools are defensive, or do they I'm curious as to what their response is, if there is any kind of legal intervention or legal engagement with schools who, for instance, may have sought to impede the child's freedom of expression around the genocide in Gaza. So 2 questions there, but I'm seeing going, and I'm seeing faces that need a glass of wine. So I'm going to hand over. Ben, I think, would you mind taking Paul's question? And I think, in fairness, you had thrown out some hope, so everyone else has to think of positive things for Christy.
Yeah, look, I mean, in West Africa, the concern we had in a bunch of those Atlantic coast states was discrimination in counterterrorism policing against the Pearl people, so Fulani herders who are traditionally cross-border cattle herders, a minority group which have been heavily stigmatized, both socially and by some government authorities, as being supporters of terrorists or sometimes part of terrorist groups. And just after we visit, I mean, and this links to the hope side. The president of Benin came out and had a very strong public statement directed to all security services, saying we absolutely have to make amends with the Fulani community. You can't stigmatize them as terrorists. This is just traditional superstition. So I think another example from Benin. Their law says, as it should, children must not be detained amongst adults. But sure enough, we go into a prison with 600 Jainim and other jihadi groups being held on suspicion of terrorism. A 14-year-old kid is detained amongst supposedly hardcore terrorists. We went to the Minister of Justice. He immediately ordered an inquiry. It was a failure of their age verification guidelines, which were actually quite good and developed along with the UN. And they were keen actually to do better. And it wasn't just because I was there. I mean, he was genuinely committed reformist. On migration, yeah, I mean, I mentioned narco-terrorism. I mean, this is absolutely a new front. I mean, it's always been a front, but it's taking on a new complexion in the Americas. Not just the US, by the way. I mean, other countries that have designated narco cartels, gangs as terrorists include Canada, Honduras, Ecuador, Argentina. This is spreading, and this has all happened in the last one or 2 years, and it's led to summary deportations of alleged gang members, now killings on the high seas. So we are going to push in the review of the global strategy next year for some new language on protecting migrants, for sure. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Throwing over to Christy's comment, maybe very quickly. Actually, I'll finish with Christy and Hope, but maybe actually, because I will finish with Christy's comment and Hope, but I think I'd be keen to hear Zainab to hear a bit more about the film, if that's okay, please.
Yes, of course. So I am currently working on a documentary film, specifically on the pager attack on the children specific. And the reason why I chose to focus on children is that even though under the international humanitarian law, it's an unlawful attack to target a combatant who isn't engaged in direct hostilities, you could still find people having different views on it. So I wanted to give the children's or to show the children's perspective, because it's always hard not to empathize or sympathize with the child. However, I still had some comments from people who would tell me, oh, but they are Hezbollah's children, which makes me wonder, would this still make it legit to target them? Or is it okay to just dehumanize them like that, even if their parents are are fighters or engaged in any military organization? This doesn't give any lawful right. The other reason why I chose this topic is that a lot of people don't know that children were also part of this are victims of this attack. They did believe the Israeli narrative that this attack was very precise, and a lot of people celebrated it as well. I was in Poland when the attack happened, and I could see that a lot of people were very misinformed about what happened at that time. A lot of people asked me as well, and I could also see it in some of the online comments, that why would children hold pagers in the first place? And this goes to them thinking that they are fighters in the field, and their parents just send them to just like fight the enemy or whatever. But what I try to focus on in this documentary is about the children, about their hobbies, about how they do in schools, about what's their favorite game, or what do they like. One of the children told me, my favorite thing to do is to watch Mr. Beast on YouTube, for example. I tried to show who are these children before the attack and how are they after the attack. Before doing this interview, it's also very remarkable or very important to mention that I was very nervous to talk to them because I was worried that I'm gonna maybe cry in the middle of the interview. But I even spoke with a psychologist before going there, asking her how to approach them because they just came out of a trauma. And it was very surprising that all of the interviews we were just laughing. They were being goofy. They were just telling me, "Oh, I'm tired. It was just I just want to end this interview." Blah blah blah. So we were just laughing the whole time. It was really really warming to witness. And one of the children also came to me, and he's after the interview finished, and he told me, "I want to thank you for showing interest in me or in my life or in me as a person instead of just asking me about the attack itself," because most of the journalists who interviewed the children after the attack were only focusing on where were you when the attack happened, how did you feel, where did you wake up, why did you pick it up, and so on, and then dismissing the child or how the child what did the child lose and so on. And the biggest fear for me is that these children who are getting a lot of media attention locally at least will at some point lose this one day, because then the media is going to shift something else. So I wanted to document that. And during my documentation, I also ran, I remembered.
Zainab, I'm so sorry, but I'm just, I'm probably, I'm slightly concerned that the connection might go quite quickly. So perhaps if you can finish up, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I
yes,
think
of course.
having issues at this end, so I'm slightly concerned we'll lose you mid-sentence. Sorry.
No,
Do you
no,
want to
of
make a
course, of
final
course.
point? Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to say that this is basically what I'm working on, and I'm trying to address this documentary to the Western audience specifically rather than the regional or Arab audience, because it's very important, and it's also very focused on the international humanitarian law specifically. So it's from a humanitarian perspective. Thank you so much.
It sounds fantastic. Thanks so much, Zainab. And I'm going to our final speaker, Maryam. We'll just very quickly respond to.
Thank you. Then with your question about hope, and how to ensure that parents are empowered. So at the moment, the cases that we're working on, we are trying to empower the parents themselves, take the responses back to school and engage in meaningful dialogue with school about how to ensure that the rights are balanced. I've had one situation where a solicitor's letterhead was required. And that did have the effect of de-escalating the situation quite rapidly, where an antagonistic approach had been taken by that particular head to the wearing of a keffiyeh by a child who was Palestinian. What actually, just reminding them of the Article 10 duty and their right to their expression of their identity did in fact result in a identity day at school, where the child was permitted to wear it for that day and permitted to express their personal identity. And so it's really about empowering parents directly.
That's great. That's really, really good to hear. You see, Christy, you have your take-home hopeful point, right? I'm going to finish now before any more negativity fills the room. And I'm going to invite you to drink. I'm sorry for keeping you a shameless 10 minutes beyond what I said I would, but it was really interesting. And, we're all here. So thank you so much. I mean, I just want to say, this evening happened because of huge work by Emily and Sian, by Ray and Tallulah. Thank you all so much for that, because of course, without the efforts behind the scenes, the event doesn't happen. I want to say thanks to all of you for coming in on a hideous night of the year, but I hope that you will join me or agree with me that it has absolutely been well worth it. A fantastic lecture by Ben, with superb input by Zainab, and really important diverse insights from Fatima, from Leo, from Maryam. And I just want to I'd like to ask you all, before we head towards the drinks and the snacks at the back, to just join me to thank them so much again for their brilliant input and insights this evening. Thank you. And I'm sorry you're not with us to have, a glass of something with us later, but I'm sure we'll see each other soon, Fatima and Zainab, and thank you so much again. Anyway, you could hit the back of the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.